I went on a solo trip to Japan to find myself, but when I got lost in the city and struggled with the language barrier, I realized I was more alone than I had ever been in my entire life. I remember the exact moment I stepped off the plane in Tokyo, Japan, the smell of the airport mingling with the faint scent of jet fuel and cleaning solution. It was early morning, and the sun was only just beginning to stretch across the horizon, casting pale gold reflections on the sleek, metallic surfaces of the airport. My heart was pounding in a mix of excitement and nerves, my stomach twisting with anticipation. This trip had been my idea of liberation, a chance to escape the suffocating predictability of my life back home and maybe, just maybe, find some sense of clarity about who I was and who I wanted to be. I had been trapped in the same city for too long, swallowed by routines that had begun to feel like chains. I had imagined Japan as a canvas of possibility, a place where I could dissolve into the anonymity of a foreign crowd and emerge with a sense of purpose, a clearer understanding of myself. The first thing that struck me, even before the hum of the airport escalators or the chatter of travelers, was the sound. Japanese is a language I had only heard in passing, in movies and YouTube videos, but hearing it spoken live was like stepping into a living symphony, each syllable precise and melodic. The announcements over the PA system were unintelligible, rhythmic phrases that seemed almost musical to my ears, yet utterly incomprehensible. I smiled politely at the travelers around me, my own English a fragile lifeline that seemed increasingly inadequate. The airport staff looked at me with professional neutrality, and I realized instantly that I was a tiny alien dropped into a world whose rules I didn't yet understand. With my luggage in tow, I headed toward the train station, my first real challenge of the day. The station was a maze of polished steel and glass, every corridor bustling with people moving like currents in a river. I had studied a little about the subway system, had memorized a few key phrases, and had even downloaded a translation app, but the scale of it all made my preparation feel laughably insufficient. There were signs in English in some areas, but most of them were buried in a sea of kanji that resembled abstract art more than anything I could decipher. I tried to follow the crowds, assuming instinctively that they knew where they were going, and yet, within minutes, I realized I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. It hit me slowly at first, a subtle creeping awareness that I didn't belong here, not in the way the locals moved, with a fluid confidence, or in the way travelers who seemed more seasoned navigated the chaos. My stomach began to churn as I glanced around, seeing the same unyielding signage and unfamiliar faces everywhere I looked. I tried to ask for help, but every time I opened my mouth, the Japanese words that had danced so easily in my head seemed to vanish. I fell back on English, smiling hopefully, but the responses were polite nods and unintelligible phrases, sometimes followed by a quick departure, leaving me standing awkwardly in the middle of a crowd that moved too fast to notice me. I remember gripping my backpack strap so tightly that my knuckles went white. I was alone, utterly alone, and that was a reality I had romanticized but never truly confronted until this very moment. I had thought I was going on this trip to find myself, but now it felt like the city had found me first and stripped away all the illusions I had about independence and bravery. The truth was harsher than I expected. I was small and insignificant in a place that had its own rhythm and rules, and I had no choice but to navigate it blindly. After what felt like hours of wandering through endless corridors, staircases, and platforms, I stumbled upon a small kiosk where I attempted to buy a train ticket. I pointed at the map, using the few words I had memorized. Shinjuku, 1 ticket, please. The attendant looked at me, eyebrows raised slightly, then began rattling off a stream of Japanese so fast that I couldn't even parse the individual words. I nodded repeatedly, smiling, pretending I understood, but the uncertainty gnawed at my confidence like a persistent, invisible worm. Eventually, I managed to purchase a ticket, more through guesswork than comprehension, and rushed to the platform, my anxiety coiling tighter with each step. The train ride itself should have been a relief, a chance to breathe, but it only amplified my sense of disorientation. Every stop had names that I couldn't read or pronounce, and the map inside the train car, though marked with some English, was dizzyingly complex. I watched other passengers, businessmen, tourists, students, navigate with ease, their faces calm and unhurried, and I felt the weight of my own clumsiness pressing down on me. The sensation of being invisible yet utterly exposed at the same time was suffocating. I realized that I had never truly been alone like this before, not in the way that matters, not where every single decision and misstep rests entirely on you, without anyone to guide, correct, or reassure you. When I finally arrived at what I thought was the right station, the day had begun to slip into a gray haze. The streets were still crowded, but the shadows had lengthened, stretching across neon signs and reflecting on rain-slicked asphalt. I had planned to check into my hostel quickly and explore a bit before nightfall, but now I wasn't sure where I was, nor did I know how to explain it. I tried to follow my GPS, but my phone battery was dwindling faster than I expected, the small screen a weak guide in the midst of this living labyrinth. I wandered through narrow alleyways, past tiny izakayas with laughter spilling onto the streets, past vending machines that glowed like beacons, past crowded intersections where I was just another ghost in the sea of moving bodies. Everywhere I turned, I felt the pang of isolation intensifying. The language barrier was more than inconvenient. It was a wall, a reminder that I couldn't reach out to anyone, that I couldn't bridge this gap with gestures alone. I tried to ask strangers for directions, waving my hands, pointing at my phone, and yet the answers I received were always too fast, too vague, leaving me more confused than before. The feeling of helplessness, of vulnerability, was almost intoxicating, a bitter cocktail of fear and awe. By the time I found a small park to sit and collect myself, the sun had disappeared entirely, replaced by the electric hum of streetlights and the glow of digital billboards. I sank onto a cold bench, my legs trembling from walking so much, my mind racing with the events of the day. I thought about calling my family or a friend, but the idea of speaking into a phone and trying to explain my situation in broken Japanese and English felt absurd. The isolation was absolute. I was utterly cut off, and in that moment, I understood the raw meaning of solitude. As night deepened, a thin drizzle began to fall, and the city that had seemed so magical in the morning now felt distant and alien, its charm overshadowed by my inability to connect with it or even find my way. I watched people pass, couples holding hands, groups laughing, street performers drawing small crowds, and I felt a pang of envy so sharp it was almost physical. I had imagined my trip as a journey of self-discovery, a time to meditate on my life and my choices, but instead, I had stumbled into a harsh truth. Being alone is not the same as finding yourself. Alone is often cold, confusing, and relentlessly unforgiving. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the drizzle hitting the leaves and the distant rumble of traffic, wondering if I had made a mistake. The romantic idea of a solo journey, the fantasy of wandering a foreign city and emerging enlightened, now seemed naive. I had underestimated how much I relied on the familiar, language, faces, culture, for comfort. Without it, even the smallest challenges became mountains, and every misstep was a reminder of my fragility. Eventually, exhausted and shivering, I forced myself to stand. My hostel was still somewhere out there, and I had to find it before night fully swallowed the streets. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, weighed down by fear, fatigue, and an unfamiliar loneliness. I realized, bitterly, that my trip had begun, but not in the way I had imagined. This wasn't a story of freedom. It was a story of survival, of confronting a version of myself I had long avoided. The one that panicked when everything familiar disappeared, the one that could not easily ask for help, the one that realized how profoundly alone it could feel in a world filled with people. I don't know exactly when I stopped caring whether I looked foolish or lost. Maybe it was when I ducked into a small convenience store to ask for directions, only to leave more confused than when I entered. Maybe it was when I realized my phone battery was dying faster than I could navigate the labyrinthine streets. Maybe it was the realization that my carefully crafted plan, my meticulously scheduled itinerary, was meaningless if I couldn't even reach my first destination. I was alone, more alone than I had ever been, and the city seemed to mock me for it, stretching endlessly in all directions, indifferent to my struggle. And yet, in that crushing solitude, there was a strange, unspoken promise. I could feel it, faint but persistent, that this trip, as terrifying and disorienting as it had begun, would force me to confront myself in ways I had never imagined. For the first time in years, I was utterly untethered, stripped of all the superficial anchors I had relied upon, language, familiarity, social networks, and thrown into the raw, unfiltered reality of just being me. It was terrifying, yes, but also strangely exhilarating. Somewhere between the exhaustion, fear, and frustration, I sensed the possibility that this ordeal, this being lost in a city that refused to bend to my expectations, might be exactly what I needed. As I finally stumbled toward a street I recognized from my barely functioning GPS, the neon lights flickering in the rain, I realized that this was just the beginning. The night was far from over, and neither was the city. I had survived the first wave of disorientation, the first taste of isolation, but I knew deep down that the real challenge was yet to come. And as much as I wanted to run back to the safety of my familiar world, I also knew I couldn't. I was here, in Tokyo, alone, and there was no turning back. The streets had grown quieter by the time I realized just how dark it had become. The neon lights glowed persistently, reflecting off the slick pavement, but they offered little guidance. My legs ached from hours of walking, and my shoulders were sore from the weight of my backpack, which now felt more like a burden than a convenience. Every corner I turned seemed familiar, yet somehow completely wrong, the layout of the city mocking my attempts to make sense of it. I tried to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more disoriented I became. I had no idea if I was moving closer to my hostel or farther away, and every sign I glanced at was an indecipherable blur of kanji that my translation app couldn't process fast enough. I felt a tightening in my chest, a physical pressure that seemed to echo my mental panic. The realization struck me like a cold wave. I was entirely, undeniably lost. The romantic notion of a solo adventure was replaced by a stark, almost suffocating loneliness. I had imagined the solitude of traveling alone as something liberating, but what I was experiencing now was utterly different. It was exposure, vulnerability, and a deep, gnawing sense of helplessness. I couldn't even communicate effectively if someone wanted to help me. My attempts at Japanese were pitiful, a mixture of broken syllables and hopeful gestures, and I could feel the embarrassment creeping into my bones. As I walked down a narrow alley, the sounds of the city felt distant, muted by the growing fog of my anxiety. Tiny shops with glowing paper lanterns seemed to watch me pass, their windows reflecting fragments of my own face in the dark. I tried to focus on breathing, telling myself it was just the first night and that I could figure it out eventually, but the nagging voice in my head whispered relentlessly, "What if you can't? What if you get completely turned around and there's no way back?" The drizzle had intensified, now coming down in steady, icy drops that soaked through the thin jacket I had hastily grabbed in the morning. My fingers were numb, and the edges of my vision blurred as I squinted at the map on my phone. The battery icon flashed red, and I cursed under my breath, realizing that my lifeline to guidance, my connection to the outside world, was fading fast. Panic and frustration began to mix with the cold, creating a suffocating stew of anxiety. Every step forward felt like walking deeper into an unfamiliar maze with walls I couldn't see. I passed a small ramen shop with its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Steam curled out of the doorway, and I imagined the comforting smell of broth, soy, and noodles. My stomach grumbled painfully, reminding me that hunger was an entirely separate kind of torment from my disorientation. I debated going inside, hoping to ask someone for directions, but the thought of trying to communicate under my current linguistic limitations was terrifying. What if I embarrassed myself? What if they laughed or didn't understand? What if I couldn't even ask the right question? The weight of self-consciousness pressed down on me almost as heavily as the damp jacket clinging to my skin. Eventually, I realized I couldn't wander aimlessly forever. I had to do something, anything, to regain a sense of control. I ducked into a convenience store, the fluorescent lights harsh and too bright after the darkness outside. The interior smelled of plastic, coffee, and canned food. Shelves were stacked meticulously with items I didn't recognize, snacks shaped in ways I couldn't imagine tasting, drinks in bottles I couldn't identify. The cashier, a young woman with a gentle expression, looked at me expectantly as I approached. My mouth opened, but no words came out. I tried again, louder this time. "Excuse me, Shinjuku Hostel." I waved my hands toward the phone's map, desperate for some form of understanding. Her eyes flicked to my phone, then back to me, and I felt a momentary spark of hope. She spoke rapidly in Japanese, the words flowing like water over a rock, and I understood almost nothing. I shook my head, trying to convey that I didn't understand, and for a fleeting second, I thought she would walk away. But then she grabbed a small notebook and pen, scribbled a few characters, and slid it across the counter. I leaned in, squinting at the neat kanji, and tried to follow along with my phone. Slowly, painstakingly, I realized she had written the directions, step by step, with simple arrows. Relief washed over me, warm and sudden, a fragile thread of security in the otherwise overwhelming night. I thanked her with as much gratitude as my limited Japanese allowed, bowing slightly, my face burning from the effort and emotion. She smiled and nodded politely, and I stepped back into the alley, clutching the note like a lifeline. The directions were clear enough, or at least they seemed so, but every turn I took afterward was filled with hesitation. I double-checked the map, compared it with the streets, and still, a creeping sense of doubt followed me. What if I had misread it? What if I ended up even farther away? The night pressed down on me, heavy and unyielding, and I realized that even with help, I couldn't escape the sensation of being completely alone in this sprawling city. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. The streets became quieter, the drizzle now a steady rain that chilled me to the bone. I had begun to recognize landmarks, tiny visual cues that reassured me for a moment before disappearing behind me. I found myself muttering under my breath, trying to anchor myself in sound and observation. Left, then right, then straight. Not that street, this street. My internal dialogue became a lifeline, a way to cling to some semblance of logic amidst the chaos of my surroundings. Then, in a moment that would remain etched in my memory, I realized I had taken a wrong turn. A familiar lamppost appeared in the distance, but the streets leading to it were blocked by construction barriers. My sense of direction, fragile as it was, shattered completely. I felt the panic surge, hot and suffocating, as I realized that for the first time in my life, I was utterly at the mercy of a world I couldn't read, couldn't navigate, and couldn't understand. I stopped, rooted to the spot, rain soaking my hair and dripping down my face, and felt tears sting my eyes. The humiliation, the frustration, and the loneliness all collided in a heavy, tangible weight. I was lost, truly lost, and the city that had seemed magical in the morning now felt hostile, indifferent, almost mocking in its vastness. That's when I noticed him, or, more accurately, he noticed me. A figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley, umbrella in hand, walking slowly toward me. My first instinct was fear. I had no idea who this stranger was, and my vulnerability made me hyper-aware of every possible danger. But there was something in his gait, the calmness with which he approached, that made me pause. He stopped a few feet away, nodded politely, and then spoke in Japanese. I froze, unsure of how to respond, my words useless. He repeated himself, slowly this time, pointing toward the street I had intended to take. My relief was immediate and overwhelming, though tempered by lingering caution. He gestured for me to follow, and I did, hesitant but desperate. Each step I took behind him was filled with tension, a mix of gratitude and anxiety. The rain continued to fall, and the streets seemed quieter now, almost intimate in the way the neon reflected off puddles and wet asphalt. I realized then how fragile my sense of security had been, how quickly it could dissolve into fear and isolation. Following him, though, gave me a temporary reprieve. The city hadn't changed. It was still vast, confusing, and alien, but I wasn't completely alone. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to hope that I might survive this ordeal without succumbing to panic. Eventually, he stopped in front of a small, modest hostel tucked between two larger buildings. The sign was simple, written in both Japanese and English, and a wave of relief surged through me. I turned to thank him, fumbling with words, and he merely nodded, smiling faintly before disappearing into the night. I watched him go, and in that brief moment, I realized the paradox of my situation. I had been terrified, isolated, and overwhelmed, Yet this stranger's small act had reminded me that even in a city that felt incomprehensible and hostile, human connection, however fleeting, still existed. I stepped inside the hostel, dripping wet and exhausted, and was greeted by warmth, light, and the comforting murmur of other travelers. The reception desk staff welcomed me politely, and for the first time in hours, I allowed myself to breathe. I had survived the night, survived the disorientation and the loneliness, but I knew deep down that this was only the beginning. Tokyo was vast, unpredictable, and merciless in its complexity, and I had only scratched the surface. My journey of self-discovery had begun in earnest, not in the scenic temples or bustling streets I had imagined, but in the raw, unfiltered confrontation with my own fear, confusion, and isolation. Sitting on my bed later, the rain still tapping gently against the window, I realized how profoundly this night had changed me. Every misstep, every failed attempt at communication, every moment of panic had peeled away layers of comfort and certainty I had taken for granted. I had faced a version of solitude I had never known, one that was unrelenting, confusing, and sometimes cruel, but also illuminating. And though I was exhausted, my body and mind aching from the ordeal, there was a spark deep within me, a fragile sense that perhaps, through this chaos and disorientation, I might finally begin to understand who I was. The next morning, the hostel's faint, comforting hum was the first thing I noticed before my eyes even opened. Sunlight, filtered through narrow curtains, spilled onto the modest bed, painting faint golden rectangles across the pale walls. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to forget the chaos of the previous night, the rain-soaked streets, the dizzying, unending labyrinth of Tokyo that had left me trembling, exhausted, and utterly alone. I lay there, letting the sounds of quiet footsteps and muted conversations seep into me, as if the presence of others, even strangers, could somehow provide an anchor to reality. But reality, I quickly realized, didn't care about my fragile comfort. Rising from the bed, I stretched with a stiffness I hadn't known existed, every muscle sore from yesterday's ordeal. I was still wet and cold in my clothes, the dampness clinging stubbornly to my skin, a persistent reminder of my vulnerability. The hostel's small bathroom offered only lukewarm water, and I shivered under the stream, feeling the rawness of my skin and the ache in my body. Even as I dressed in dry clothes, meticulously laying out my plan for the day, there was a gnawing tension in my chest, a lingering echo of the panic I had felt when lost in the rain. Stepping outside, the streets were different in daylight, less intimidating, less alien, but no less overwhelming. Tokyo's energy had shifted from the night's quiet tension to a bustling, almost aggressive vibrancy. Trains screeched past elevated tracks, the rhythmic thrum of engines vibrating through the ground. Neon signs glimmered despite the sun, their colors sharp against the sky. People moved with purpose, their conversations rapid, incomprehensible, yet confident, as though they were all part of some intricate, invisible choreography that I could neither see nor understand. I tried to navigate toward the areas marked on my map, but every turn revealed streets that twisted unexpectedly, alleys that ended abruptly, and signage that mocked me with its indecipherable kanji. By late morning, hunger had become a gnawing ache in my stomach. I ducked into a small cafe tucked between two larger buildings, the bell above the door announcing my entry with a soft chime. Inside, the smell of fresh bread and coffee was intoxicating. Warmth enveloped me, a temporary reprieve from the cold, alien world outside. I approached the counter, attempting once again to communicate in fractured Japanese, pointing at the pictures on the menu with tentative confidence. The young barista, smiling, pointed to a particular set, and I nodded gratefully, hoping my choice was appropriate. I ate silently, the bread warm and soft, the coffee bitter but grounding. Outside, the city continued to pulse with life, indifferent to my presence, and I felt the fragile thread of comfort fray once again as I remembered that I had no plan beyond this small refuge. After finishing, I wandered further into the city, determined to see more, to experience Tokyo in the way I had imagined before I arrived. Yet the closer I tried to get to landmarks and districts I had read about, the more lost I became. Every street seemed to fold back on itself, a maze with no beginning or end. I realized then that my previous reliance on maps, my naive belief that technology could solve all problems, was laughably insufficient. I was navigating not just a city, but a culture, a language, and a rhythm entirely alien to me. Every small misstep, every failure to understand a sign or an instruction, compounded the anxiety that had begun the previous night. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion was starting to weigh heavily. My feet ached from constant walking, and my arms ached from gripping my backpack too tightly. I found myself in a crowded shopping district, surrounded by towering buildings and endless glass facades reflecting the sun, creating dizzying patterns of light and shadow. I tried to read the signs, to orient myself, but the kanji and kana blurred together in a disorienting mosaic. A wave of vertigo hit me, not from any physical imbalance, but from the sheer scale and intensity of the city. I leaned against a railing, closing my eyes for a moment, trying to anchor myself in breathing and observation. Yet, even then, the panic lingered beneath the surface, ready to surface again at any misstep. And then it happened. I realized, suddenly and with a jolt, that I had no idea where I was. My carefully considered plan for the day, the route I had plotted, even my minimal understanding of the geography, was meaningless. I was adrift in a sea of unfamiliar streets, each one twisting unpredictably, each one populated with people whose conversations, gestures, and expressions I could not decode. A cold wave of fear washed over me, stronger than anything I had felt before. I was utterly alone, more profoundly than I had ever been in my entire life. I tried to find a cafe or convenience store, some small sanctuary where I could gather myself and make sense of the chaos, but each attempt only deepened my disorientation. Streets that appeared welcoming from one angle became labyrinthine from another. I began to feel the first sharp pangs of desperation, a gnawing sense that no one could, or would, understand my predicament. I muttered under my breath, repeating the few Japanese phrases I had memorized, hoping that someone might hear me and offer guidance. But the responses I received were either incomprehensible or non-existent, leaving me more frustrated and vulnerable than before. The afternoon stretched into evening, and the city's pace began to change once again. The sharp sunlight softened into gold, casting long shadows across the streets and buildings. The neon signs began to flicker, preparing for another night. I wandered aimlessly, my feet carrying me without thought, my mind consumed with a mix of fear, fatigue, and a strange, perverse fascination with my own vulnerability. I realized, with a shiver, that my journey of self-discovery was unfolding not in quiet contemplation or scenic exploration, but in raw confrontation with my own limitations. I had imagined Japan as a place to find myself, to shed layers of doubt and insecurity, yet what I was finding instead was my own fragility magnified, exposed by a city that refused to bend to my expectations. Then, as night approached, my situation worsened. The streets became narrower, the crowd thinned, and a chill wind began to blow, carrying the scent of rain and distant food stalls. My phone's battery warning flashed again, reminding me that my lifeline to navigation, communication, and security was nearly gone. The panic returned, more insistent this time, pounding in my chest with a force that made each breath shallow. I stumbled into a dimly lit alley, trying to retrace my steps, and realized with a sinking feeling that I had entered a part of the city I didn't recognize at all. Shadows stretched from buildings like grasping fingers, and the faint hum of distant traffic was the only reassurance that I wasn't completely cut off. In that alley, I felt something I hadn't expected, the weight of isolation, of being utterly invisible and yet acutely exposed, pressed down on me until it was almost physical. I thought about calling someone, my parents, a friend, but the thought of speaking, explaining my predicament in a language I barely knew, was impossible. I felt a lump form in my throat, a tightening that made swallowing painful. Tears, stubborn and hot, threatened to spill over, but I refused to let them. I didn't want to succumb completely. I needed to hold on, somehow, to some fragment of control. It was then that I noticed movement at the far end of the alley. A small group of people, laughing in Japanese, passing carelessly close. My heart leapt, half from hope, half from fear. I considered approaching them, attempting to ask for directions, but I hesitated, terrified of embarrassment, rejection, or misunderstanding. I realized then how completely dependent I was on others' goodwill, how fragile my sense of autonomy really was. Even as I chastised myself for hesitation, my feet refused to move, rooted in the concrete and doubt. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the cold seeping into my bones. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it. A small, dimly lit convenience store tucked into the corner of the alley. Its warm interior, fluorescent and welcoming, promised a temporary reprieve. I stepped inside, shaking slightly, my eyes scanning the shelves for guidance, for comfort, for a human face that might understand. The cashier, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, looked at me patiently as I pointed helplessly at my phone and muttered a few broken phrases. He spoke slowly, enunciating each word, and though I understood only fragments, his patience and calmness were enough to calm my spiraling anxiety. He gestured to a map on the wall and, using hand signals, guided me step by step. Relief, immense and almost overwhelming, washed over me, mingled with gratitude and a bitter recognition of how dependent I had become on strangers in this foreign world. By the time I left the store, night had fallen fully. Tokyo's neon glow, once dazzling, now seemed almost oppressive, a reminder of the city's enormity and my own insignificance within it. I followed the directions carefully, step by step, each turn deliberate and cautious. Eventually, I arrived at a small, modest shrine tucked between modern buildings. The faint scent of incense hung in the air, and a few soft lights illuminated the path. I sat there for a long time, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of leaves, reflecting on the day's events. I realized, with a shiver that traveled through my body, that this was the moment when the journey truly began, not the arrival in Tokyo, not the novelty of foreign streets, but this raw confrontation with isolation, vulnerability, and dependence. I was utterly alone, yet surrounded by life, and in that paradox, I began to understand that finding myself wouldn't be simple or neat. It would be messy, frightening, and exhausting, demanding every ounce of resilience I could muster. And yet, despite the fear, the confusion, and the loneliness, there was a spark of determination. I would survive this. I had to. The morning arrived slowly, hesitantly, as if Tokyo itself were reluctant to unveil the day after the relentless intensity of the night before. I awoke in the modest hostel room to the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant clatter of early commuters. The bed beneath me felt foreign yet comforting, a small island of warmth and stability in the turbulent ocean of my thoughts. For a long moment, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the city through the thin walls, trying to summon the courage to step outside again. I had survived the night, navigated streets that had seemed endless, and received help from strangers I barely understood, yet the relief was tempered by a gnawing anxiety. What awaited me today, beyond the comforting threshold of this room? I dressed slowly, meticulously, checking my backpack and belongings with almost obsessive attention. Every item felt simultaneously indispensable and insufficient. My clothes were dry but smelled faintly of yesterday's rain. My phone was charged just enough to be functional, yet I knew it would not last a day if I relied on it too heavily. The anticipation of venturing out, combined with lingering fatigue, created a peculiar tension, a combination of excitement and dread that pressed against my chest with relentless insistence. As I stepped into the hallway, the soft murmur of fellow travelers provided a faint, grounding soundtrack, yet I felt the familiar, nagging awareness that once I stepped outside, I would be utterly alone again. The streets were alive with movement, the morning sunlight reflecting off glass and steel, creating dizzying patterns that made my head spin slightly. The rhythm of Tokyo was relentless, almost musical in its complexity, yet incomprehensible to me. I tried to anchor myself with landmarks I recognized, small details that had become familiar through repeated exposure, but each turn introduced new uncertainty. The city, vast and intricate, seemed determined to test me, to push me toward the limits of my patience and resilience. Every street, every alleyway, every fleeting glance from a passerby was a reminder that I was an outsider, navigating a world that had its own rules and cadence. As I wandered further, the reality of being alone began to manifest not just physically, but psychologically. The isolation of yesterday had been acute, punctuated by fear and disorientation, but now, in the clarity of daylight, it transformed into a subtle, persistent ache. I noticed it in the way my hands trembled slightly when I pulled out my phone to check directions, in the way my chest tightened when I tried to ask a passerby for help, and in the way my mind raced with worst-case scenarios, imagining endless detours, missed trains, and the inescapable sense of being perpetually lost. Every attempt to communicate, every glance at a sign I could not read, reinforced the invisible barriers that separated me from the city and its people. By mid-morning, hunger and fatigue merged into a dull, persistent ache that gnawed at my focus. I ducked into a small cafe, the warm, fragrant air immediately soothing my frayed nerves. The smell of fresh coffee, baked pastries, and toasted bread wrapped around me like a blanket, offering a brief reprieve from the relentless pace of the streets outside. I ordered slowly, pointing to a picture on the menu and repeating the words I had practiced. The barista, young and patient, smiled, responding with a gentle rhythm of speech that I struggled to follow. I nodded, feigning understanding, and retreated to a corner table, savoring each bite, each sip, as if grounding myself in the familiarity of taste and warmth could counteract the disorienting vastness of the city. Yet even in this moment of temporary solace, my mind drifted back to the night before, to the alleyways, the rain, the suffocating sense of being lost. I realized that my journey was not just about navigating Tokyo physically, but navigating the landscape of my own mind, confronting fears and insecurities I had long buried under routine and predictability. The city had become a mirror, reflecting not only my confusion and vulnerability, but also the unacknowledged facets of my identity. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that solitude was not merely the absence of others. It was a confrontation with oneself, unshielded by familiarity or comfort. Determined to move forward, I left the cafe and set out into the streets once more. I followed my map with cautious diligence, retracing my previous paths and venturing onto new streets with tentative curiosity. The morning stretched into afternoon, the sun climbing high and casting harsh, unrelenting light on the pavement. My legs ached, my shoulders protested under the weight of my backpack, yet I pressed on, driven by an almost desperate desire to regain control, to find a sense of direction both literal and figurative. Each street I navigated successfully, each landmark I recognized, offered a small victory, a whisper of confidence that perhaps I could survive this alone. As the day progressed, I began to notice subtle patterns in the city's rhythm. The way the trains moved, the cadence of pedestrian crossings, the timing of shop openings and closings, all of it formed an intricate, almost invisible map that slowly became intelligible through observation rather than language. I realized that survival in this environment depended not solely on words or technology, but on patience, attention, and the willingness to adapt. This insight, small yet profound, instilled a tentative sense of empowerment. I was learning, however haltingly, to exist in this foreign world on my own terms, to navigate uncertainty without succumbing entirely to panic. Even so, the isolation persisted. By late afternoon, the city's energy had shifted again, the relentless rhythm of work and transit giving way to the softer, more intimate pulse of evening. The streets glowed with neon signs, their colors reflecting in puddles left by intermittent rain. The chill had returned, seeping through my clothes, and my mind began to wander into darker territories. I thought of home, of friends and family, of the comforting predictability I had left behind. The nostalgia was bittersweet, accompanied by guilt for having fled the very people who cared for me. Yet simultaneously, I felt a strange exhilaration, a recognition that I was forging a new path, one that demanded courage, resilience, and an intimate confrontation with fear itself. By nightfall, I had wandered into a quieter district, the neon glow dimming and the streets narrowing. My exhaustion was profound, a physical and mental weight that threatened to collapse me at any moment. Yet in that darkness, I noticed small signs of life. tiny restaurants with flickering lanterns, the scent of food wafting through narrow alleys, the occasional passerby whose hurried steps and quick glances seemed almost protective in their casual anonymity. I began to sense that the city was not hostile, merely indifferent, and that this indifference could be navigated, respected, and ultimately understood. In a small, lantern-lit park, I sat on a bench and allowed myself to breathe deeply, to process the cumulative weight of days spent in mere constant disorientation. The hum of distant traffic, the soft rustle of leaves, and the occasional laughter of children created a strange, grounding symphony. For the first time, I allowed myself to confront the depth of my solitude without panic, to sit with it, feel it, and recognize it as a part of the journey rather than an obstacle to be avoided. I realized that the fear I had experienced was not merely about being lost in a foreign city. It was a manifestation of deeper insecurities, anxieties, and doubts that had followed me throughout my life. And then, almost imperceptibly, a shift occurred. I recognized that this journey, terrifying and disorienting as it had been, was revealing a version of myself I had long ignored. The resilience I had discovered in the moments of panic, the patience cultivated through repeated disorientation, and the humility in accepting help from strangers were all facets of an identity I had never fully acknowledged. I understood, with a clarity that was both startling and comforting, that being alone did not equate to being powerless, nor did it signify failure. Instead, it offered a rare opportunity for introspection, growth, and the emergence of inner strength. As night deepened, I began to navigate the streets with a newfound confidence, small but tangible. Each step was deliberate, informed by observation, experience, and intuition rather than reliance on technology or familiarity. The city, vast and intricate, remained incomprehensible in its entirety, yet it had become a landscape in which I could move with purpose, however tentative. I realized that solitude, while often uncomfortable and frightening, could also be a source of profound empowerment, a space in which one's character, resilience, and creativity were tested and honed. Eventually, I returned to the hostel, the familiar walls and modest room providing a sense of closure and accomplishment. I sank onto the bed, drained yet exhilarated, and reflected on the journey that had unfolded over the past days. I had arrived in Tokyo seeking clarity, freedom, and self-discovery, yet the path to these goals had been far more challenging than I had anticipated. I had been lost, disoriented, and utterly alone, confronted with fears and insecurities that had long remained dormant. Yet, through this struggle, I had discovered something fundamental: the capacity to endure, adapt, and find direction even in the face of overwhelming uncertainty. Lying there, the city's nocturnal rhythm filtering through the thin walls, I understood that my journey was far from over. Tokyo remained vast, unpredictable, and endlessly complex, and I would encounter further challenges, moments of confusion, and pangs of solitude. But the fear that had once threatened to paralyze me now seemed more manageable, tempered by experience, resilience, and a growing awareness of my own inner strength. I had survived my first days, confronted my deepest vulnerabilities, and emerged with a clearer understanding of what it meant to be truly alone, and, paradoxically, what it meant to begin finding oneself. As I drifted into sleep, the neon glow of the city reflecting softly through the window, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. The journey that had begun in panic, confusion, and isolation had become a process of discovery, resilience, and growth. I understood, at last, that being alone in an unfamiliar world was not a curse but a crucible, one that could forge clarity, confidence, and an intimate understanding of self. And in that understanding, I felt a profound, almost ineffable sense of liberation, an acknowledgement that solitude, once feared, could become a powerful companion on the journey of life.